They laughed when he walked into the room, not because he was funny, but because they had already decided he was nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of invisible witnesses, casting cold shadows across faces twisted with mockery. And in that moment, standing there with trembling hands clutching a worn notebook, he felt the weight of every dream he'd ever carried begin to crack under the pressure of their stares. This is the story of a man who was buried alive by shame, who descended into a darkness so complete that even his own reflection became a stranger, and who discovered that the deepest humiliation can become the forge where unbreakable souls are made. His name doesn't matter because this could be anyone's story, yours, mine, the person sitting alone in a coffee shop right now wondering if there'll ever be enough. But for the sake of this moment, let's call him Daniel. Daniel grew up in a small apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbors' arguments and his own mother's exhausted sighs after 16-hour shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. He learned early that dreams were luxuries, something other people's children got to have, the ones with fathers who came home and mothers who smiled without that heaviness behind their eyes. But Daniel dreamed anyway, secretly, ferociously, in the margins of second-hand textbooks and on the backs of discarded receipts his mother brought home from the places she cleaned. He wanted to be an architect. Not just any architect, but the kind who could redesign entire neighborhoods, who could take forgotten corners of the city and transform them into spaces where people like his mother, people who worked until their hands ached and their spirits dimmed, could find beauty and rest. He sketched buildings in the early morning hours before school, structures with curves that caught sunlight and courtyards where children could play without fear. His drawings were crude at first, all wrong proportions and impossible physics, but they held something true, something that hummed with intention and hope. His mother found them once, spread across the kitchen table at 3 a.m, and she cried, not from sadness but from a terrible mixture of pride and fear, because she knew what the world did to boys with dreams bigger than their circumstances. The scholarship was a miracle, the kind that arrives in a thin envelope that feels too light to hold your entire future, but somehow does. A prestigious architecture program at a university where the buildings themselves seemed to mock his existence, all marble columns and manicured lawns maintained by people who looked like his mother, invisible in their labor, essential in their absence. Daniel arrived with everything he owned in 2 duffel bags, and a heart beating so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it, could hear the desperation and hunger and sheer audacity of a poor kid thinking he belonged in rooms designed for legacy admissions and trust fund confidence. The first day of studio class, he walked in 15 minutes early, a habit born from years of his mother's warnings that being on time was a luxury only afforded to those who could risk being late. The studio was vast, all exposed brick and industrial lighting, drafting tables arranged like altars to creativity, and he chose a spot near the back, not out of shyness but out of instinct, the same instinct that told him to make himself small, unnoticeable, safe. Other students filtered in, their laughter easy, their designer backpacks hitting tables with the casual thud of people who had never had to carry their entire lives on their shoulders. They talked about summer internships in Tokyo and Barcelona, about their parents' firms and their gap years spent studying Renaissance architecture in Florence. And Daniel unpacked his supplies, a basic drafting kit bought with his mother's overtime money, and felt the first whisper of doubt creep into his chest like cold water. The professor was a legend, Marcus Whitfield, whose buildings graced skylines in 6 countries and whose critiques could make graduate students weep. He swept into the room with the energy of someone who knew his presence alone commanded respect, and he began explaining the semester's main project, a community center designed for a hypothetical low-income neighborhood. And Daniel's heart surged because this was it. This was why he was here, to design spaces for people who needed them most. But when Whitfield displayed the neighborhood's demographic data, when he showed images of crumbling buildings and chain-link fences, Daniel heard it. The subtle shift in the room's energy. The way his classmates leaned back in their chairs with a detached curiosity, like anthropologists studying a foreign tribe, not architects designing for human beings. He poured everything into that first project. While his classmates treated it as an academic exercise, Daniel treated it as a sacred duty. He stayed up until dawn, neglecting other classes, surviving on vending machine coffee and the granola bars his mother sent in care packages, with notes that said things like, "Proud of you, baby," in handwriting that shook from exhaustion. His design wasn't the flashiest. It didn't have the sweeping curves and dramatic cantilevers that some of his classmates incorporated, but it had something else. It had truth. He designed spaces for single mothers who needed child care, courtyards where elderly residents could garden and reclaim dignity, community kitchens where people could share meals and stories. Every line he drew was informed by a life lived in those margins, by knowing what it meant to need beauty and finding only fluorescent lights and peeling paint. Presentation day arrived with the weight of judgment. One by one, students presented their visions, and the professor nodded, critiqued, occasionally praised. Some designs were brilliant exercises in form, others were technically impressive but soulless, and a few showed genuine understanding of the assignment's humanity. When Daniel's turn came, his hands shook as he pinned his drawings to the board. He had practiced his presentation dozens of times in the mirror of the shared bathroom in his dorm, but standing there, feeling the eyes of 20 students who had never worried about rent or food, or whether their dreams were too expensive for their reality, his voice caught in his throat like a prisoner trying to escape. He began speaking, explaining his design philosophy, how he incorporated natural light to reduce energy costs while creating spaces that felt hopeful, how he designed flexible community rooms that could serve multiple purposes because he understood that struggling communities needed adaptability, not monuments to architectural ego. His voice grew stronger as he talked, fed by the passion that had sustained him through every doubt, and for a moment, for one brief and beautiful moment, he felt seen, felt like his experience and his vision mattered in this room of privilege and possibility. Then Marcus Whitfield stood up, walked to the board, and the room went silent with anticipation. The professor studied the drawings with an expression Daniel couldn't read, tilting his head, squinting at details, and Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to break free from the cage of his body. Whitfield turned to face the class, and what happened next would replay in Daniel's mind for months, years. A scene burned into his memory with the permanence of scar tissue. The professor smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone about to deliver a lesson. And he asked Daniel where he was from, what his background was, and Daniel answered truthfully, honestly, because he didn't yet understand that honesty could be weaponized. Whitfield nodded slowly, turned back to the drawings, and began his critique. He called the design serviceable but uninspired, said it lacked architectural vision, that it was too focused on function at the expense of form, and worst of all, most devastating of all, he said it looked like something designed by someone unfamiliar with the language of contemporary architecture, someone who perhaps would be better suited to construction management than design. The words landed like physical blows, each one finding a soft spot in Daniel's armor, and he stood there, frozen, unable to defend his work or himself because the professor wasn't wrong in the language of academic critique, but he was profoundly wrong in understanding what Daniel had tried to create. What destroyed Daniel wasn't just the criticism. Critics were part of architecture. It was what happened next. One student, a guy named Preston, whose father owned a firm that designed corporate headquarters, laughed, actually laughed, a short bark of amusement, and others joined in, nervous laughter that filled the studio like poison gas, and someone whispered loud enough to be heard, "Should have stuck to scholarship kid buildings," and the room erupted in scattered chuckles that tried to disguise themselves as coughs. Daniel felt his face burn, felt heat crawl up his neck and across his cheeks like he was being branded. And he looked at the professor, waiting for him to shut it down, to remind the class of respect and professionalism. But Whitfield just moved on to the next presentation, dismissing Daniel with a casual wave of his hand. And in that dismissal, in that profound act of indifference to humiliation, Daniel learned that some people's pain doesn't register as real, that when you come from nothing, they expect you to be grateful for any crumbs of attention, even cruel ones. He sat down, his drawings still pinned to the board, and watched the rest of the presentations in a fog of shame so thick he could barely breathe. After class, no one spoke to him. No one offered sympathy or solidarity. They packed their expensive bags and filed out, discussing lunch plans and weekend trips. And Daniel sat alone in the empty studio, staring at his design, trying to understand where he had gone wrong, trying to reconcile the pride he had felt in his work with the humiliation that now coated it like rust. That night, he called his mother from the hallway of his dorm because his roommate had friends over and he couldn't let them see him cry. She answered on the first ring, the way she always did when he called, her voice thick with sleep because it was late and she had work early. And he tried to tell her what happened, tried to explain the shame and the laughter, but the words came out broken, punctuated by sobs he couldn't control. And she listened, saying nothing, just breathing on the other end of the line, and when he finally went quiet, exhausted from crying, she said something he would never forget. She said, "Baby, they can laugh at you because they've never had to fight for anything real. You're not building for them. You're building for us. Don't you dare let their small minds make you forget why you're there." But forgetting is easy when remembering hurts so much. Daniel stopped participating in class. He sat in the back, turned in the minimum required work, designed buildings without soul because soul invited judgment, and judgment invited pain. His grades slipped from exceptional to adequate, and no one noticed or cared because adequate was all they expected from him anyway. He stopped sketching in the early morning hours, stopped imagining buildings that could heal neighborhoods, stopped believing that his background was a strength rather than a liability. The worst part wasn't the external humiliation, it was the internal collapse, the way shame rewrites your story, convincing you that their version of you is the true one, that you were foolish to dream beyond your station, that the world has natural hierarchies, and you were born to serve, not to create. Months passed in this fog of diminishment. He went through the motions of being a student, attended classes, completed assignments, existed in a perpetual state of making himself small enough to avoid notice. His mother sent care packages that went unopened because he couldn't bear to see her handwriting, couldn't bear the reminder of her faith in him when he had none left in himself. Friends from home texted asking how things were going, and he replied with lies, with great and busy and loving it, because admitting the truth meant admitting failure, meant confirming everyone's suspicions that he had reached too high and fallen exactly as far as gravity intended. Winter came early that year, turning the campus into a postcard of privilege, snow covering the manicured lawns and historic buildings in a blanket of white that looked beautiful from inside warm classrooms but felt brutal when you were walking to the library at midnight because you couldn't afford to heat your dorm room above survival temperatures. Daniel had taken a job washing dishes at one of the campus dining halls, work that started at 10 p.m. and ended at 2 a.m., work that left his hands raw and his body exhausted, but that paid just enough to cover the expenses the scholarship didn't. The textbooks and supplies and basic dignity of not having to choose between food and laundry detergent. One night, finishing his shift, his hands pruned and aching from hours in scalding water, he took a different route back to his dorm, cutting through the architecture building because it was warmer, and because some part of him, some stubborn ember that refused to fully extinguish, still loved being around those spaces even if he no longer believed he deserved to occupy them. The building was dark except for a few studios where graduate students worked through the night, and Daniel walked slowly through the halls, looking at the displays of student work, the models and drawings that represented thousands of hours of labor and passion. He stopped at a particular display, a project from 20 years ago, and something about it caught his attention. The design was for a community center, eerily similar to the assignment that had destroyed him, and the architect's statement talked about designing for dignity, about creating spaces where marginalized communities could find beauty and belonging. Daniel leaned closer, reading the name on the plaque, and his breath caught because the name was Marcus Whitfield, his professor, the man who had humiliated him. And the project description mentioned that Whitfield had grown up in public housing, had been the first in his family to attend college, had fought his way into architecture through scholarships and night jobs and sheer refusal to accept the limitations others placed on him. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical force, stealing the air from his lungs. The professor who had dismissed his work, who had allowed the class to mock him, who had suggested he wasn't sophisticated enough for architecture. That professor had once been exactly where Daniel was, had once carried the same dreams born from struggle, had once believed that architecture could be an act of service and redemption. And somewhere along the path from that idealistic student to tenured professor, Whitfield had transformed, had absorbed the academy's values, had learned to see poverty and struggle not as sources of insight, but as deficits to overcome, markers of lesser-than status that needed to be educated away. Daniel stood in that dark hallway, surrounded by the ghosts of architectural ambitions past and present, and felt something crack open inside him, not breaking but breaking through, like a seed splitting its casing to reach toward light. The anger came first, pure and hot and clarifying, anger at Whitfield for forgetting where he came from, anger at his classmates for their casual cruelty, anger at a system that made people like him feel grateful for the opportunity to be humiliated. But beneath the anger was something more powerful, a recognition that his shame was not his own creation, but a weapon someone else had handed him, and he could choose, right now in this moment, whether to keep carrying it or to forge it into something else entirely. He went back to his dorm and unpacked his mother's care packages, read every note she had written, every "proud of you," and "you're going to change the world," and "don't forget where you come from." And he cried again, but this time the tears weren't from shame. They were from grief, mourning the months he had wasted, the confidence he had surrendered, the dreams he had buried to make others comfortable. He pulled out his old sketchbook, the one he had brought from home covered in coffee stains and hope, and he began to draw, not for a grade, not for approval, but for himself, for his mother, for every person who had been told their dreams were too big for their background. The next day in studio, when Whitfield walked in with his usual commanding presence, Daniel raised his hand. The professor looked surprised because Daniel hadn't voluntarily participated in months, and there was a long pause before Whitfield acknowledged him. Daniel stood up, his heart racing but his voice steady, and he asked if they could discuss the professor's community center project from his student days, the one displayed in the building's hallway. The studio went quiet, students sensing something happening, some shift in the air, and Whitfield's expression changed, a flicker of something, memory or discomfort or recognition, crossing his face. Daniel didn't attack, didn't accuse. He simply talked about the project, about its philosophy of dignified design for marginalized communities, about how it seemed to come from lived experience rather than academic theory, and he asked what had inspired it, what had driven the young Whitfield to see architecture as a tool for social healing. The professor stood silent for a long moment, and Daniel could see the war happening behind his eyes, the tension between the man he had become and the student he had been. And when Whitfield finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of its usual authority. He told the class about growing up in a housing project where beauty was considered unnecessary, where function meant survival and nothing more, about being told by his first architecture professors that his street perspective was a liability rather than an asset, about learning to code switch between his authentic voice and the voice the Academy demanded. He talked about the shame he had carried, the imposter syndrome that never fully disappeared no matter how many buildings he designed or awards he won, and somewhere in that admission, something happened in the studio, a collective exhale, as if everyone had been holding their breath without knowing it. Whitfield looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, and what passed between them wasn't an apology exactly but an acknowledgement, a recognition of harm done and received, and the professor said something that changed everything. He said that he had been harder on Daniel because he saw himself in Daniel's work, saw the raw passion and service-oriented design that he himself had been told to abandon in favor of more sophisticated approaches. And in trying to spare Daniel the pain he had experienced, he had inflicted a different kind of pain, the pain of denial and dismissal. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation, and sometimes understanding why someone hurt you is the first step toward reclaiming your power. From that day forward, Daniel stopped trying to design like his classmates and started designing like himself. He embraced his background not as a deficit, but as a unique lens, a way of seeing architecture that most of his peers could never access, no matter how many books they read or buildings they visited. His next project was unapologetic in its focus on affordability and dignity, incorporating lessons from his mother's life, from late-night shifts and thin walls, and the desperate human need for spaces that acknowledge your worth. When he presented it, he didn't apologize for its priorities or its aesthetics. He defended them with the passion of someone who had crawled through shame and emerged on the other side. The response was mixed. Some students still didn't get it, still saw his work as lacking sophistication, but others began to see what he was doing, began to understand that architecture's highest calling wasn't to impress other architects, but to serve human needs. More importantly, Daniel stopped needing their approval. He had found something more valuable than validation from people who had never questioned their right to occupy space. He had found his voice, his purpose, his unshakable knowledge that his perspective mattered not, despite his background but because of it. Senior year, Daniel's thesis project caught the attention of a small nonprofit organization that designed affordable housing for communities across the country. They offered him an internship, not at a glamorous firm designing museums and corporate towers, but at their modest office where architects worked for less money and more meaning, where every project was a direct response to human need rather than ego or profit. Daniel accepted immediately, and on the day he graduated, his mother in the audience with tears streaming down her face and hands worn rough from years of cleaning other people's spaces, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride, uncomplicated, and fierce. The years that followed weren't easy. Nothing about choosing a harder path ever is, but they were real. Daniel designed community centers and affordable housing, playgrounds in neighborhoods that had never had them, spaces where children could learn and play without the weight of poverty crushing their imaginations. He never forgot the shame of that studio presentation, never forgot the laughter or the professor's dismissal, but he transformed those memories from wounds into fuel. Every building he designed was a quiet rebellion against everyone who had suggested he didn't belong, that his dreams were too big, that architecture was for a certain kind of person, and he wasn't it. He went back to his old neighborhood, to the apartment complex where he had grown up, and convinced the management company to let him redesign their courtyard. He did the work for almost nothing, just materials and the satisfaction of transforming the concrete slab where he used to shoot basketball into something beautiful. Benches and gardens, and a community bulletin board where residents could share resources and celebrations. His mother attended the opening ceremony, and she walked around touching the benches and flowers like they were precious artifacts, and she whispered to him, "This is what I always knew you could do, baby. Build beauty for people who need it most." 10 years after that humiliating studio presentation, Daniel was invited back to the university as a visiting critic, and he walked into the same studio where he had been broken and mocked, except now he was the one offering feedback and guidance. He looked at the students, saw their mix of confidence and insecurity, their privilege and talent and blind spots, and when a student presented a project that reminded him of his own early work, service-oriented and passionate but rough around the edges, he made sure his critique was honest but generous, pointing out areas for growth without crushing the spirit that drove the work. After class, a young woman approached him nervously, clutching her sketchbook the way he once had, and she asked if they could talk. She told him she was there on scholarship, first in her family to attend college, and she felt invisible most of the time, felt like her work was always judged more harshly, felt like she was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to be humiliated. Daniel looked at her, saw himself reflected in her uncertainty and hunger, and he told her something no one had told him when he needed it most. He said, "They're going to try to make you small because your dreams make them uncomfortable. They'll say you're not sophisticated enough, not conceptual enough, that you need to forget where you came from and learn to speak their language. Don't. Your background is not a deficit, it's a superpower. You see things they can't see, understand needs they can't imagine, and the world doesn't need another architect who designs for awards and magazine covers. It needs you, exactly as you are, building for the people who raised you." She cried, right there in the studio, and he let her, understanding that sometimes tears are the only appropriate response to being seen, really seen, perhaps for the first time in a space that usually demanded you disappear. He gave her his card, told her to reach out if she needed guidance or just someone who understood. And as he watched her walk away, shoulders a little straighter than when she had approached, he realized this was the real triumph, not the buildings he had designed or the recognition he had earned, but the ability to be for someone else what no one had been for him, a witness to their worth when the world insisted on their worthlessness. Daniel's story isn't unique. That's what makes it so powerful. Every day, people walk into rooms where they don't quite fit, where their accents or backgrounds or perspectives mark them as other, where they're expected to be grateful for the opportunity to prove themselves worthy of space they already deserve. Some of them break under the weight of that shame, internalize the message that they're not enough, reshape themselves into acceptable versions that fit more comfortably into other people's expectations. But others like Daniel, they take that shame and they forge it into something unbreakable. They use the heat of humiliation to burn away everything that isn't essential, leaving only the core of who they are and what they're meant to do. The truth is that shame is a choice we're given, not a condition we're born into. Someone has to hand it to you, convince you to carry it, persuade you that their judgment of your worth is more accurate than your own. And the revolutionary act, the thing that changes everything, is the moment you put it down. Not because you've overcome it through achievement or success, not because you've finally proven yourself worthy in their eyes, but because you realize that their eyes don't define reality, that their laughter doesn't determine your value, that their limited imagination doesn't limit your possibilities. Daniel succeeded not by becoming who they wanted him to be, but by becoming more fully who he already was. He didn't abandon his background or his perspective. He weaponized it, used it as a lens through which to see problems others ignored and solutions others dismissed. And in doing so, he didn't just build buildings. He built a life that was true. That was his. That couldn't be taken away because it wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. This is what they don't tell you about shame. It's only powerful if you believe it. The moment you recognize it as a tool, a weapon someone else hands you hoping you'll use it to destroy yourself, you can disarm it. You can look at the people who laughed and recognize that their cruelty says everything about them and nothing about you. You can hear the criticism that tries to disguise contempt as concern, and choose to extract any useful feedback while discarding the poison. You can stand in rooms where you're not supposed to belong and claims space not through aggression, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear. Years later, when people ask Daniel about his success, about how he built a practice focused on social impact in a field often driven by ego and aesthetics, he always went back to that moment in the studio, to the laughter and the shame and the feeling of being reduced to nothing. He said those moments, as painful as they were, taught him something invaluable. They showed him that other people's limitations are not his reality, that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift because it frees you from the pressure of expectations and allows you to work in service of something bigger than approval. He also talked about his mother, about how her resilience in the face of endless indignity taught him that dignity isn't something others grant you. It's something you carry within yourself, regardless of circumstances. She cleaned offices where people barely acknowledged her existence, but she did the work with pride and care because her worth wasn't determined by their recognition. She raised a son to dream beyond their circumstances, not by pretending those circumstances didn't exist, but by refusing to let them define the boundaries of possibility. She taught him that you can come from nothing and still offer everything, that poverty might limit your resources, but it doesn't limit your vision if you refuse to let it. So here we are, at the end of this story that isn't really an ending because Daniel is still building, still designing spaces for communities that need them, still showing up as proof that the people who tried to humiliate you don't get to write your final chapter. Here we are with a question that matters more than any answer. What have they told you that you can't do? What room have you walked into where the laughter suggested you didn't belong? What dream have you buried because someone convinced you it was too big for who you are? Maybe you're watching this from a dorm room right now, feeling out of place and wondering if you made a mistake by reaching beyond your background. Maybe you're in an office where you're the only one who looks like you or sounds like you, where every day requires you to translate yourself into something more palatable, more acceptable. Maybe you're in your childhood bedroom, paralyzed by the fear that trying and failing would be worse than never trying at all. Wherever you are, whatever your story, I want you to know this: they can laugh at you, dismiss you, suggest that you're not enough, but they cannot make you believe it unless you choose to. Your shame is not your identity. Your struggle is not your limitation. Your background is not your barrier. These are all stories others tell about you, and you have the power to write a different ending. Not through bitterness or revenge, not through becoming hard and closed and cruel in return, but through the radical act of remaining open, of staying true to your vision, even when the world suggests you should abandon it, of building for the people and purposes that matter to you regardless of whether they matter to anyone else. What have they told you that you can't do? Tell me in the comments below. Let me know where in the world you're watching from because your story matters and your voice deserves to be heard. And if this story touched you, if it reached some place in you that needed to hear that your dreams are valid and your presence is necessary, subscribe and leave a like, because this channel exists to remind you that silence always comes before glory, that the moments when you feel most invisible are often right before you become undeniable, and that the shame they tried to bury you with can become the soil where your greatest achievements grow.